I'll hand over to you. Welcome, everyone. My name is Arthur van Buitenen. I work at IDLO. I'm part of the climate justice team, and we're so thrilled to host the World Youth for Climate Justice, as climate justice is one of IDLO's strategic objectives. So very welcome to you all, distinguished ambassadors. Very welcome to IDLO and all friends here. I wish you a very inspiring session. And with that, hand over to Aditi.
Thank you so much, Artu. It is very nice to be here indeed. So good afternoon and a very warm welcome to one and all to a multi-stakeholder discussion on the Youth Climate Justice Handbook towards a progressive ICJ Advisory Opinion on climate change. This gathering is convened by World's Youth for Climate Justice, the Pacific Island Students Fighting Climate Change, and Greenpeace Australia Pacific. I am from World's Youth for Climate Justice. I am 27 years old, and I come from the coastal city of Mumbai, India. Even though my roots lie in the sea, I trekked in the Himalayas with my father since I was 14 years old. When I was in my teens, I remember we used to slide down the mountains just for fun to go back to our camps. And because it used to be really heavily snowed in. The last time I went trekking, I could only spot snow on the mountains as if it was dots on a snow leopard's back. Today, the eastern coast of India is battling a devastating cyclone, and the western states of Maharashtra and Gujarat have been facing massive crop destruction and drinking water shortage because of droughts, and have been recorded and also have recorded highest surface level temperatures this year. I'm here today voicing my concern, actively trying to bolster climate action by exhausting all possible avenues there are through a due process. My name is Aditi Shetty, and I will be your moderator today. The General Assembly on 29th of March of this year, for the first time with consensus, passed a resolution for an advisory opinion with questions related to state obligations to mitigate and adapt to climate change. We're gathered here today because this possesses a unique and time-sensitive opportunity to the International Court of Justice to establish jurisprudence on climate change and human rights. While this movement was founded by 27 students in the Pacific at the UN level, this momentous task was spearheaded by the excellent leadership of the government of Vanuatu. In support of World Youth for Climate Justice and PISFCC, we have launched a Youth Climate Justice Handbook, which presents youths and civil societies' legal arguments and how we as youth want the court to answer these questions. The purpose of the handbook is to make these proceedings as accessible as possible and also serve as a template submission for those who want to know more status report on relevant principles of international law and human rights law relevant to climate change. We have an eminent panel today discussing the ICJ AO initiative and its current phase with a specific focus on the use and value of the handbook. We have the Ambassador of Bangladesh to the Netherlands, Ambassador Riaz Hamidullah, Dr. Christopher Bartlett, Head of Climate Diplomacy Program for the Government of Vanuatu. We will then be joined by experts, Edgardo Sobenes, who is an international lawyer based in The Hague and also one of the co-authors of the legal memorandum with an extensive experience in international litigation before the ICJ and a unique practice in coordinating and management of international teams. We also have Dr. Maria Antonia Tigre, who will be joining online. She is the Senior Fellow of Global Climate Litigation at the Seven Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia Law School. Finally, we'll be joined by Vishal Prasad, the Campaign Director of PIFCC, and Katrina Bullock, the General Counsel for Greenpeace Australia Pacific. After this interesting discussion, the floor will open for questions from the audience. Before I give the floor to our experts and CSO representatives to take this discussion forward, I'm very honored to have Ambassador Riaz Hamidullah and Dr. Christopher Bartlett as keynote speakers will discuss the progress and the process of the ICJ Advisory Opinion. Ambassador Hamidullah has been a source of inspiration and a massive supporter of our youth campaign. Following a successful diplomatic reception hosted by Bangladesh a few days ago here in The Hague, it is, I think, also key to mention that Bangladesh has been a core group member state and has seen the resolution get adopted. Now, I kindly invite the ambassador to the floor and enlighten us on what motivated Bangladesh to co-sponsor the Advisory Opinion resolution, and how does Bangladesh envision its participation in the upcoming proceedings?
Thank you, Aditri. Like the UNGA resolution, Aditri has posed a question as to what has motivated Bangladesh. But I think I'll try to share reflections because I see two distinguished ambassadors from Latin America, Ambassador Arnoldo, and also Ambassador Guatemala there, and dear friends. It's been 3 months, nearly 3 months that we are from New York. But we are actually in the midpoint because we are again 4 months to go and touch. So we are 3 months past, 4 months to go to make our country submissions before the ICJ. We have had, for the benefit of all online and also those who are in person, we have had some conversation also with the court. There are some dotted lines as to how we would go, meaning the states would go before the court make their individual submissions. When the process began in New York, many kept their fingers crossed whether we would have 100+ countries to join in support. And I think we have crossed so much beyond. And now we really we are in the process where in 2015, when we are adopting the UN Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development unequivocally, by all countries, we shared something. I mean, we adopted something called Agenda 2030, the set of SDGs. And we were asked, the authors were asked, particularly the ambassadors of Kenya and Ireland, the co-chairs, how would you summarize it? And they said, this is a blueprint which should define and create the pathways for shared prosperity through shared responsibility. I'll start from that. Quite often we miss it out and we try to define it in our own ways, maybe for convenience or otherwise. But I think that should, for us, for Bangladesh, that actually brings us to this exercise as well. Now, while I was preparing and thinking, we had a conversation, a very stimulating conversation yesterday with Aditri and another colleague, young activist. And after that, I came across two fascinating things. I'm not a lawyer. I must not pretend at all about it. But there are two things which came across, I think, which should actually not only excite, but really should get every one of us. One is the Uganda versus Netherlands case in 2015. I have educated myself on that, but I think equally more, equally, if not more fascinating, is a case in Pakistan, which went before the Lahore court in 2015, where a farmer stood up and walked up to him, which is called Legari case. It's not my intention to deal with it. I think there are a couple of things which actually, as we are working on the submission back in Bangladesh, are really coming up. And I think to some extent, it may also apply to many in the room. One is post-Rio, we have been going to the UNFCCC processes and thought and think and are made to believe that climate change discourse is essentially to remain around or in the UNFCCC process. But we also face the limits of it. One of the limits is that of the convention 4 pillars, we are so much focused on mitigation and adaptation, but not going or at all allowed, may I say, to look at the other critical pillars, which is technology and finance. Finance, you know, but quite often little do we reflect on technology, because technology to us, Bangladesh, that is inherently linked to adaptation. Why? Because every possible adaptive solution or innovation in terms of people, in terms of economy, in terms of ecology, which we often tend to think in terms of protection, the solutions have to be found through technology. If I give an example, in Netherlands, if you see, they say that every adversity is an opportunity, meaning that every adversity has a possible solution. So technology is one pillar. Now, then when we go to the sustainable development discourse, we find that climate change, for whatever reason, are said that no, climate change doesn't have a room here. It has to be in the UFCCC process. As a result, countries like Bangladesh, not to speak of the SIDS seeds, are actually left in a very hapless situation. Because when we go to the UFCCC process, I have heard enough times on AOC's statements, we could see the yearnings of that. So as a result came something in between, which is not to be negotiated, a negotiating platform called the CVF, the Climate Vulnerability Forum, and where they're also trying to bring not only the environment or foreign ministers, but also the finance ministers. So my point and submission to you is that we have seen the sort of limits or limitations in terms of the existing discourse. As a result, that actually prompted us when we saw that the initiatives were coming in New York, we jumped on it early on. So I hope I could sort of articulate as to what actually were going on and where from we had the urge to come in. It's simply not motivation, it's more than that. Now, in the process, we also find some of the big things remaining, and this actually we are trying to think that how best we'll try to articulate. How do we approach vulnerabilities? Aditya, if you have that book called Climate Ground Zero, I think that might be useful. I just want to flash that. Because every other country, we have 170 million people, 170. Sometimes people may struggle. Netherlands is 17 million people, many of the European. But is it simply a number? And what is the narrative of the 170 million? Does it mean, because if you go to the hotspots, the coast, the mangrove forest, or the dry zones, it's very different. And quite often we try to sort of make it flat. As a result, many of the population get missed out. If I bring out from Bangladesh, for example, in the coast we have one kind of, but we also have a silent disaster called riverbank erosion. Now that riverbank erosion is not something that is caused by within the people. How many of you would imagine that Bangladesh river systems, one of the most active, brings every year or carries every year 1 to 1.5 billion metric tons of siltation. Anywhere else you go, people think siltation or sedimentation is a boon. For us, it's more of a menace. Why? Because it's a flat country and you cannot flush it out. And where would you flush? So that actually then connected us, because I think in this process, we'd also be looking at the legal systems, and obviously, rightfully so. So then we went to UN Human Rights Commission. Some of you may be aware, but those of you who may not be, I would also request humbly that let's also in the process look at and reflect what's been going on in the Human Rights Commission for a decade now. Every year since 2013, there's an annualized resolution coming on climate change and human rights. What I'm trying to summarize is that we're trying to move to every possible space, to sustainable development discourse, to UNFCCC, also to rights space, and now to the legal space. Now, coming over to legal space, couple of things actually crossing our minds, and I take this opportunity to actually flag to you, and possibly assuming that this may help all of us because we're in a shared boat. We are looking more and more into the final part of the resolution and trying to really understand that how can we really make an impact. One is that how would we articulate injury or harm caused to people? It's easy from development discourse, easy to define, but then something to be made palatable, something to be taken into cognizance from legal point of view, that would remain a challenge, and that's why dotted lines are there. Also, when we say that climate change poses existential challenge to people, and then consequently to their livelihoods as well, where the damages are irreparable, as a result of which we have gone to loss and damage. How do we make it kind of make it solid, if I may use a word, I mean, or concrete before the legal case, because hardly there are cases. And I'm told that lawyers or courts only move if there are cases or empirical evidences. Also, when we look at the vulnerability menu, that's what I was asking Aditri, because we have things documented, but these are the court or someone can argue these are more anecdotal. But profiling vulnerability is not easy. Just because we may not have sufficient methodologies to profile adequately, fully, and in-depth vulnerabilities, whereas we know the consequences, we know that people are suffering, we know that people are vanishing, for example. One crop failing, go to southern India, one season, one crop failing, farmers commit suicide. How do you define this? How can one define this? And how can we then go back to that particular area and say that someone can argue, no, the climate change didn't have an impact. Or others would say, we know that how climate-induced challenges caused circumstances and that led for his departure. So is it direct or indirect? In the process, we know the risk there where it can fall through the crack. I'm not going into the intergenerational equity and all. My point is that these are things which are really crossing our minds at this point of time when we are about 4 months away to go to the court like every other country. I thought that this might help just to share what's really crossing our mind. To end, I would look at each and every one of you. I think one is to make, it is generally understood and expected that the states would make the submissions to the court. But I'd also urge, argue, and challenge, if not challenge, everyone, those who are online or in person, that in every possible way, from every corner, whether you're young or through the other groups, everyone has a stake in climate change. And if that's the case, then I think in every other possible way, you need to reach your voices before the court. Today, I think social media liberates that space tremendously. I was just having a conversation to the ambassadors to ICC judge candidate this morning, and he was eloquently articulating how the digital, thanks to all the data-driven footprint in Facebook, Twitter, or else are increasingly in the body of evidences. So if that is a case, then my submission reasoning would be that I think we need to utilize these 4 months as much as possible, as creatively as possible, to make the judgeship here. Please don't get bogged down as to how they would take that into countenance or not. Let's keep it aside. But I think it's our duty to make those voices and encourage others, explain to others that how those voices should be reached. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. That was very enlightening, and all the different sectors that you touched upon regarding vulnerability, human rights, adaptation, and then concretizing evidence. I think that's quite crucial, and I'm pretty sure there'll be many submissions, and not just submissions. This other CSO movement that will bring this and is bringing this in action at the moment. Next up is joining us online, Dr. Christopher Bartlett. Just throwing the floor to you, Christopher. Just on the points of what is going to happen in the court phase, and what is the Vanuatu government's vision for the second phase. So if you could just highlight on that, that would be great. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And it's a real pleasure to join you all. Thank you so much to Your Excellency, the Ambassador of Bangladesh, for those introductory remarks. And it's a real pleasure to be working with Bangladesh and the other members of the core group to really be a part of this transformational exercise in international law, but much broader, as you highlighted. I might start very quickly with where I think all policy discussions should start, and that is with the science. And we know that for more than 5 decades, science has been providing absolutely stark warnings about the chemical and physical consequences of greenhouse gas emissions. But very sadly, in Vanuatu's perspective, the short-sighted and economically driven policies of so many states means that little heed was paid. And today, people are suffering harm. Vanuatu's people are suffering from the insidious rise of sea levels that are eating away at our villages, of course, ocean acidification, which is dissolving our reefs, terrible cyclones, which are uprooting infrastructure, and prolonged droughts, which are drying up crops before they can even be harvested. And what makes me particularly sad is that the political denigration of science was on full display at the UN climate negotiations in Germany last week, as parties refused to acknowledge that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the AR6 report, was the most comprehensive and robust assessment of climate change that we have. And this is the situation in which this ICJ process finds itself. And the result of the inaction is harm to those who are not responsible. Climate harm and suffering is being experienced now and will be exponentially worse for those born today and tomorrow. And of course, this is not just a Vanuatu problem. We're seeing now the harm in every nation on this planet. And I think that's why it was so important that we saw a global consensus in asking this question to the International Court of Justice. And I might just remind us very quickly that the Paris Agreement that His Excellency of Bangladesh mentioned back in 2015 really did highlight the importance of protecting human rights and assuring intergenerational equity. But unfortunately, the promises and the commitments of that Paris Agreement are taking us now well beyond 1.5 degrees. And very little effort seems to have been expended on the human rights elements of obligations, and even less attention on the future generations and intergenerational equity. So what's going to happen now at the court? What we've basically done is, with the core group of nations, asked for a much more comprehensive view of how state actions and state obligations are treated under international law. It is very clear that the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement is not the only international legal instrument which involves climate obligations. We, from the Vanuatu perspective, and of course from the perspective of the core group and the resolution that was adopted by the General Assembly, see obligations in a whole range of international laws and principles, whether it's from the Charter of the United Nations itself, the 2 covenants on human rights, the Declaration on Human Rights, and beyond. And what we're asking the court to do, of course, is to provide clarity. And we see the International Court of Justice as having absolutely the mandate to provide that clarity to benefit all states. In fact, it's the only principal organ of the United Nations that has not yet been given an opportunity to speak on climate change. I mean, even today, we heard the Secretary General, the Secretariat of the United Nations, the Security Council, all of these bodies have addressed the issue of climate change, including intergenerational equity and climate justice. And we're extremely pleased that this process really began, in fact, in classrooms in the University of the South Pacific in Vanuatu, where students themselves looked at this issue of only addressing climate change from one legal instrument and bypassing the importance of the comprehensiveness of international law. And those students came to us at the government and they explained and discussed and debated, and we listened. And we took the students' ideas to the United Nations and formed an incredible core group, Bangladesh and many others, 18 in total, to begin the formulation of the question, which was eventually adopted. And I'm just putting up on the screen here a summary of the question, but there are 2 parts, equally important parts. The first, of course, asked the court to look at a range of applicable treaties and principles. And we've listed out those in the resolution, but it doesn't limit the court to look at only those. Really, we're asking the court to look at international law broadly. The first question, of course, asked the court about the obligations of states under these existing treaties and principles to protect, both for present and future generations, the climate system and other parts of the environment from anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases. So it's quite a simple question of clarity. What does international law say states are obliged to do? The second part of the question takes it one step further and it says, okay, what would be legal consequences where states, by their acts or omissions, have actually caused significant harm to the environment, to the climate system, with respect to two particular groups. The first group is vulnerable states. So those states which are vulnerable due to a range of factors. And the second part of the question, critically important, is the harm with respect to people, individuals of present and future generations. So you're seeing there the issue of vulnerability that His Excellency spoke about. You're seeing there the issue of state responsibility and state-to-state responsibility. You see their human rights with people and individuals, and then this intergenerational element of the question. Now, the ambassador spoke eloquently about the range of pillars of our international systems, and one of the most important pillars, which has not been receiving the attention it deserves, is loss and damage. And one way that you could read this question about the significant harm could be loss and damage. And so it's of great relevance and could bring incredible clarity as we move forward in the loss and damage space. When the resolution was tabled on the 29th, as we heard, it was historic that it was adopted by consensus. This is the first time that the International Court of Justice has ever received a request for an advisory opinion adopted by consensus. And it also shows that this question holds value for all states. What's very important is that this is not a contentious case. And we all know that the advisory opinion will not be binding. It certainly won't target any particular state. There will be no wins or losses. This is truly to help us all make better policy at the national level, make better policy at the international level, and bring greater clarity to those areas that do not yet have sufficient clarity. So what is happening next? We have been in, as the ambassador mentioned, direct communication with the ICJ registrar. They have formally notified parties of the deadlines for this process. The first coming up in October, so we've heard only 4 months away, for states to provide their own perspective on these two questions before the court. And then there'll be an opportunity for states to respond and react to what other parties have said by the 22nd of January. So a very open and transparent process, which allows individual states to forward their own views and their own perspectives. What's also very important is that intergovernmental organizations, UN organizations, may also be allowed to provide submissions. In fact, we've heard very good news over the last few days that several UN agencies have now officially received approval from the registrar to go ahead and make their submissions. So this is not just a state-to-state process, but that there will be expert science, there will be expert policy guidance going into this submissions process. What's equally important moving forward right now is that states start to really concretize what it is that they would like to say to the court. Now, this is a very difficult process for many states who have never engaged with the ICJ. And so the handbook that we'll be hearing about today has already proven an incredible resource for states who are looking for ideas of structure and content, and particularly on legal consideration related to youth, intergenerational equity, and human rights. And so what's going to happen over the next months is that Vanuatu, the core group, and other states will be doing everything that we can to provide resources, particularly to the global south, so that they will be able to engage in this process. We will be providing pro bono legal support as requested, templates, dossiers, technical advice. So really encouraging all states who have not yet made a commitment that there is support available. And this youth handbook has been first off the rank and already being used by many, many states in the global south. So with that, Vanuatu stands with all who are really looking to find a multilateral way to address the climate crisis, but in a way that truly looks at the harm, really truly considers human rights, and must take into account intergenerational equity as it's being experienced by people across the world. Thank you so much.
And thank you so much, Christopher, for shedding light on the broadness of the question, the several importance of several UN agencies that will be, or other intergovernmental organizations that will be part of this process, and also the resources that Vanuatu is going to provide for developing states to make these submissions. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to our next speaker. I would like to invite Vishal, the campaign director of PIFCC, just to talk about the origins of the ICJ AO campaign, the role and youth of civil society, and the vision that the campaign has for the handbook and the objectives of the handbook.
Thank you, Aditi. A very warm Bulavinaka to everyone. My name is Vishal. I'm from Fiji. I'm part of the Pacific Island Students Fighting Climate Change. And we were, as Chris mentioned in his intervention, the group of students that began this campaign back in 2019, asking Pacific leaders, asking the government of Vanuatu to take this campaign forward and to request an advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice. As I stand today, you have the copies of the Youth Climate Justice Handbook, and on the second page of the memorandum, I'm reminded of the words of one of our fellow founding members. His name is Tolu Muliaina. He's from Samoa, and he wrote and coined the words of a wonderful poem that's on this in the memorandum. And I'd like to read the words. And he says, "My story is what I leave behind for my children. May they won't be scared to retell our story so that others know about who we are and where we come from, that this is what climate change cannot take from us, the Pacific warriors of climate change." And in as much words, this is the story of who we are, an attempt to safeguard, treasure, hold, and pass on. And most importantly, this is about warriors, the warriors of the Pacific who chose, who remain, and who continue to fight. And today I speak to you from this place, a place of immense hope, respect, honor, and gratefulness. And on behalf of the youth movement, please allow me to express my deepest thanks to all our partners, our stakeholders, friends of the campaign who have journeyed and labored with us throughout these many years to see the UN General Assembly finally adopt the resolution to request an advisory opinion from the world's highest court on climate justice. My task today is to provide an overview of the Youth and Civil Society campaign and, of course, the Youth Climate Justice Handbook. And briefly, Chris mentioned the origins of the campaign. It began in Vanuatu in a classroom asking governments, and we maintained our advocacy. And from beyond that Pacific-led campaign, it went global, and we found colleagues in other parts of the world who are here in this room as well, where we together formed the World's Youth for Climate Justice, and that collectively became the youth movement that was behind this push for an advisory opinion. And along the way, we met even more friends of the campaign who called themselves CSOs and alliance members of we're calling the Alliance for a Climate Justice Advisory Opinion. And these were 1,500 civil society organizations like Greenpeace, Amnesty International, Oxfam, 350, etc. And they all came on board to actively take the campaign with us and journey with us. And so together as the youth and civil society movement, we have campaigned widely to get the General Assembly to vote. We were at COPs, we were at the Pacific Islands Forum. Together with Greenpeace, we were there unfurling our overwater banner on the ocean waters in Suva, sailing in a flotilla in the East River in New York, penning letters urging support from our leaders, and creating videos, music videos and animations, etc. All sorts of advocacy tools that finally led us to see the General Assembly adopt the resolution. But in all this advocacy, the protection of people's rights and the rights of those to come after us from the adverse effects of climate change was at the center. And at the core, the youth and civil society movement have maintained this as its North Star. And we continue to highlight this as we head into the second phase of the campaign after the UNGA's adoption. It is from this place that the Youth Climate Justice Handbook concept was born. We envision that the handbook to be a pillar document for the youth and civil society campaign that would advance the most progressive arguments of human rights and intergenerational equity as a position that states can take and advocate before the ICJ. It is aimed at being a tool to help assist state participation and in the drafting of their submissions, which have a very tight deadline of the 20th of October. And we're of the view that approaching this process through a human rights lens will allow for maximum impact in shaping the development of international law to reflect precisely our call for climate justice, which would form the bedrock considerations in responding to the climate crisis. And so our goal and plan for the handbook simply is twofold. First, for states, we're looking to distribute the handbook to as many states as possible to encourage positive participation before the court and also to help lower the barriers of state participation specifically for many global South countries as they appear before the court. And secondly, we think the handbook would be a real source of power to the people. CSOs, non-state actors, and other stakeholders who can engage in conversations around these themes, that we can socialize them again amongst their networks and connections so that we are able to support the processes, whether these are through annexes, outreach to governments, etc. And so in such, the handbook can be a tool that can unite the climate movement and broadly the numerous socio-economic fights that are all increasingly becoming affected by climate change. And I'd like to close with a final call to summarize all that I have said, that we look to our countries today and our leaders to rise up to this historic moment. We cannot let this opportunity pass. For many frontline communities, this provides us with the opportune moment to have our voices heard. And as the Youth and CSO movement, we extend our hand of help to governments. In the Pacific, we hold dear the values of unity and the bond of togetherness, and that we are all in the same vaka, the same canoe that we are ready to paddle with you as our leaders, and we're ready to paddle for climate justice together. We do not believe in naming and shaming, and this campaign does not seek to do that. Rather, we're looking collectively to charting the way ahead for peoples everywhere, the way out for climate justice. We owe it to ourselves, our families, our countries, and our future generations to try at least. And we finally have a solid opportunity to do so at the International Court of Justice. And so with this, we hope you will rise and you will stand with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vishal. Thank you for telling your story, your colleague's story. Thank you for standing not just for yours, but also our human rights. And thank you for getting the WYCJ all around the world at this point. We hope to take it even forward. Moving on to the next session, our expert session, I am happy to invite Edgardo, who has been a long friend of this movement, and just for him to throw some light upon how the handbook can help overcome challenges that states might face in participation before the court. Also, why do you think state participation is crucial for this historic request?
Oh, thank you, Aditi, for the questions. And I hope this works. Yeah. Well, thank you, Aditi, and thank you very much to the organizer of this event and to PISFCC and WYCJ for giving me the opportunity to work with you and support you in this campaign during the last couple of years. I would also like to express my gratitude to Maria Jose Alarcón, who was the other main contributor of the legal memorandum, and to everyone in PISFCC and WYCJ who was involved in drafting this document. I'm going to address 4 main issues. First, I'm going to talk about the legal memorandum and how it is useful for states and international organizations. Then I'm going to talk a little bit of the importance of participation, then the importance of cooperation. And finally, I'm going to talk about certain aspects that need to be considered and need to be in the mind of the participants before the proceedings. And I'm going to do all this in 15 minutes, hopefully 16 and a half. As we all are aware, and as Christopher mentioned before, this resolution was adopted by consensus and 132 countries co-sponsored the resolution. What matters here was what does this mean? First of all, as was mentioned already, there is no parallel in history of this such an achievement, and also it confirms the commitment of the international community and the common understanding of the need to get clarification on legal principle, rights, and obligations that impact not only present generation, but also future generation. It also confirms the trust that the international community has on the International Court of Justice to carry on this important task. In this regard, it should be underlined that the advisory opinion on climate change does not seek contention. It aims to provide valuable guidance on the legal questions surrounding climate change, questions that carry significant implication for the future of the planet. There is no doubt that the expertise and authority of the court will provide valuable guidance and will foster a better understanding of the legal obligations and responsibilities of states in combating climate change. However, it will be irresponsible to assume that the advisory opinion that is being requested to the court or to the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea or the Inter-American Court of Human Rights will constitute a panacea against climate change and its adverse effects. And I understand that nobody here is claiming that, so I'm happy. The advisory opinion of the court will do what it is expected to do. And Christopher mentioned already what are the questions concerning the resolution, and that is the task of the court. The court will answer the question that has been requested by the General Assembly. And here is where the support of states and international organizations are fundamental in assisting the court. Now, given the nature of the request, it becomes evident that everyone has a role to play here in the campaign and in the proceedings before the court. For its part, the Global Youth and the Civil Society Alliance have worked intensively to get the support for this advisory opinion, and we know that they have done it successfully. Now, the Global Youth and Civil Society Alliance is focused in supporting states and international organizations in their preparations for the forthcoming proceedings. As part of this effort, we have published the Youth Handbook, which serves as a guiding document that outlines compelling legal arguments in response to the questions that will be answered by the court. The handbook, as I've been mentioned as well, is divided into three. The first part is a summary for policymaker, the second is a legal memorandum, and the third document is a status report. Now I will focus on the legal memorandum. The legal memorandum covers essential aspects of the request and clarify relevant legal and procedural law. It examines the significance of advisory opinions in international law and their role in the development and clarification of international law. It lays the legal foundation of the United Nations General Assembly requests. It outlines the court jurisdictions to issue an advisory opinion on climate change and provide legal response to the questions that the court has been asked to address. The legal memorandum also has an annex that provides valuable insights into the process of filing pleadings and presenting arguments. In sum, this document serves as a practical and well-informed legal document offering support to states and non-state actors as they prepare for the proceedings. Now we have to acknowledge that this is not the first time that a non-governmental organization publishes a document in the realm of a pending advisory opinion. As you may be aware, in the advisory opinion request on the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons, many NGOs and other entities sent communications to the court and submitted materials to it. However, those communications, those materials are substantially different from the legal memorandum. And here, I would like to elaborate a little bit. This legal memorandum is not limited to a compressed assessment of the substantive and procedural issues of the advisory opinion. On the contrary, the document addresses all the legal elements in extenso that are included in the resolution, as well as the procedural law concerning advisory opinions before the court. The analysis incorporates international law, regional law, international jurisprudence, customary international law. It refers to science and the procedural law of the court and many other aspects. Also, the drafting of the document is relevant, is crucial. We undertook the task of drafting a document in the same terms in which states prepare the written pleadings that are submitted to the International Court of Justice. This is why the legal memorandum differs from previous material that has been submitted to the court. This document is a strategic legal document designed to assist the court and participants in responding to the questions contained in the resolution. It is not an academic document with useful information. No, It is a solid legal document with coherent analysis in the best style of submissions to the court that covers jurisdictional and admissibility questions, as well as clarification on the legal nature of the questions and the non-existence of grounds that could prevent the court from issuing its advisory opinion. It is important to clarify as well that the document does not endorse one argument over another, refer to the substantive legal elements that are contained in the resolution. And the reason for this is quite simple. The aim of the handbook is to assist and support the international community in clearly understanding the scope of the request and the potential outcome. And to achieve this goal, it was necessary to present all the possible elements, informations, and arguments, so the state themselves would have the possibility to assess all these elements and allocate and identify what are the interests that they have most. We needed to provide everything, a coherent and holistic analysis. As such, this is a tool that definitely comes from the heart of the youth, but support the international community with objective legal information. Another characteristic of the legal memorandum is, and perhaps this is what makes it actually quite unique, is that the document provides answer. Legal memorandum provide answer to both questions. The way we present our answer is as follows. First, we identify the legal elements contained in the request. That refers to the preamble and the questions. Then we identify the applicable law, followed by the relevant rules of treaty interpretation. Then we explain the underlying legal rules and principles, and on the basis of a transversal analysis, we provide what we believe could be the answer of the court. And this is done on the basis of the court jurisprudence. So we have drafted in a way that the court normally draft their own advisory opinions. After providing the answer, we engage into a detailed analysis of the legal elements and arguments that inform and support what we believe could be the answer of the court. This is pretty much a simulation of the reasoning that the court includes in their advisory opinion as well. So the exercise of answering the questions provide clarity to states on the expectation of the youth, but as well on the current status of international law. And this is precisely what makes this document unique. In sum, the intention of the legal memorandum has always been, and still is, to encourage participation and to facilitate participation in the proceedings. With this document, participant can access information that will enable them to understand from the outset the process and the substantive scope of the proceedings. And this has consequences, one of those being to reduce the cost of states in the proceedings and to facilitate the initial assessment for participation. Now, I would like to turn to the second point of the question, which is participations. Sometimes there is a misconception that advisory opinion are just opinions that have no binding effects on states, which is in principle true. We heard that before from Christopher. However, I think, and I would like to clarify this a little bit because I think that this assessment completely misses the point. We could start by saying that judgments in interstate litigation have only binding effect on the parties involved to a specific case. And we know that is true as well. But it is also true that whatever comes out of such a proceedings could have an impact on international law and as such on the rules that cover international relations, especially if the proceedings concerns a multilateral treaty or convention. The same truth apply if the court confirms in a judgment that certain norms are part of customary international law. This will have a direct impact and legal implications, as you all know. So this is the case for advisory opinion. Any opinion of the court will determine what international law is today. Indeed, states won't be bound by the advisory opinion as such, but they will be obliged to comply with the law as declared and defined by the International Court of Justice. Now, there's one more aspect of advisory opinion that is particularly interesting and important in regard to participation. In interstate litigation, only the parties to a specific proceedings have the opportunity to present their pleadings to the court in a written document or during the oral proceedings. In advisory proceedings, every single state and international organization that have been invited to participate can address the court, and that participation will influence and inform the court, which translates into what the court will decide at the end with this advisory opinion. That is why this unique opportunity for states and international organizations to contribute proactively to the clarification and development of international law, and that is an opportunity that should not be missed. especially if the topic at hand concerns the future of our species. It is indeed an obligation and perhaps even a privilege of states to assist the court in answering the questions, which ultimately will result in the crystallization of emerging customary standards or the clarification of existing customary norms or general legal obligations. The advisory opinion of the court will indeed pave the way for a more sustainable future, ensuring that our actions align with international legal standards and principles. The court will have to connect previously separate areas of law, and in doing so, it will contribute to the harmonizations of legal framework across nations, promoting a more unified and effective response to global challenges, and only by participating, the states will have the opportunity to influence the answer of this court in this process, period. That's why participation is so important. Now, I would like to share some information concerning collaboration and communication. In previous advisory opinions, we worked together with a group of states in consolidating and coordinating one single voice, or a shared position at least. Remember that the work and obligation of states and international organizations is to assist the court in answering the questions. If many states share the position or a position, then the message to the court is clear. This is what the international community considers to be the law. This is what customary international law is at the moment, and this is the answer that should be given by the court. Saying that, we should collaborate once again in the realm of this request and build, to the extent that is possible, one single legal voice, or at least one coherent voice that will lead to a moment that we are not contradicting each other in front of before the court. We hope that the legal memorandum provides a first momentum or a second momentum for the beginning of a coalition of states around the interests of the youth, the climate system, and humanity. By facing one of the biggest challenges of our existence, we might even learn how to face more of our difference and evolve as a society. Law might not be a panacea, politics may not be the easiest way, and the system may not be perfect either. But the combination of the three with the input of the global youth may show us a way to move forward and positively address the biggest challenges that we are facing at the moment. As a final point, I have been asked to refer briefly to certain aspects of the proceeding in themselves. First, all participants should be aware that in advisory opinion, there are not state parties and there are no agents. There are participants, and the written statement must be signed by the duly empowered person by the states or the international organizations. This person will be in charge of the case and be the representative of the state or the international organization before the court. Second, the written statements and the written comments are not accessible to the public. These documents are confidential. In accordance to Article 106 of the Rules of Court, the written statement and the annex documents to those written statements will be made accessible to the public on or after the opening of the oral hearings. And this is something that should be kept in mind because occasionally some authorities of a participant state might consider it politically useful to make a statement based on the documents filed with the court. And this cannot be done. Just 2 more minutes. I was asked to address this at the end, so this cannot be done. The confidentiality has to be respected. Third, the court usually allows for 2 rounds of written pleadings and 2 rounds of oral hearings. We have heard already that the court has issued an order with the dates of submissions. We're still pending, and that will come after the dates for the hearings, oral hearings. But in this regard, concerning the written documents, it should be kept in mind as well, in the interest of good administration of justice, that it is advisable for states and international organizations to include all the documents and evidence that they will refer to during the oral hearings. Normally, states are only allowed to refer to those documents that are part of the dossier of the case unless they're publicly available. So this is important while they're preparing the written documents to be submitted. And one additional point here that we must remember is that the role of the participants, once again, is to assist the court in answering legal questions. This is not a contentious case, and that has implication in the way you draft your documents. For example, participants here do not file or do not present final submissions, but conclusions. The participants inform the courts on the elements that they consider relevant for the court to issue its opinion. That's it. Additionally, in the case of advisory proceedings, it is possible, and I think that we are going to talk about it a little bit later, but it's possible for international non-governmental organizations to submit written statements and or documents on its own initiative. However, there's a caveat. These documents won't be considered a part of the case file. We can discuss a little bit about that later during the Q&A session. Although I can say by now that the legal memorandum is one of those documents that will be placed in the ICJ. Another point that I would like to mention, and I'm almost closing, I apologize, is the option for joint statements. It is perfectly possible for 2 or more states to present joint statement to the court. This possibility, it is true, it has not been much explored before, but there is no reason why it shouldn't be used now or in the future, especially if 1 or more states share the same position and they would like to present it as a unit to the International Court of Justice. And finally, and this is a little bit more for us to think about it, is Article 68 of the Statute and Article 102 of the Rules of Court, which recognize that the court shall also be guided by the provision of the Statute and the Rules of Court, which apply in contentious cases to the extent to which it recognizes them to be applicable in the advisory proceedings. This means that the court has certain flexibility to use other provisions containing the rules and the statutes that normally are applied in contentious cases if they consider it appropriate to apply it in non-contentious cases. This has to be considered as well by the parties and the international organizations. They might find it useful to use other provisions that are not obvious in order to advance their arguments. And that also places certain limitations. For example, just to mention one, there is a recent practice that indicates that the amount of document that can be annexed to the written statements cannot exceed 750 pages. So all of this has to be considered, and I'm going to stop here. I apologize. There was a lot that I was asked to address, but I did my best, and I hope that we can engage further during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Edgardo. I understand there was a lot for you, a lot of responsibility on your shoulder, and I'm pretty sure there'll be many, many questions coming your way. Just in the interest of time and segueing further into the future, I would like to give the floor to Maria Antonia now to and ask her question about what would a favorable ICJ AO look like, and what would that mean for a progressive development of international law and broadly for climate action?
Thank you so much, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. I hope you can hear me. Is the sound working all right? Okay. All right. So, esteemed colleagues and distinguished guests, it's really an honor to virtually stand before you today as we gather to acknowledge the tremendous efforts of the Pacific Island students fighting climate change in the world's Youth for Climate Justice. I would first like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to these inspiring young leaders, not only for organizing this momentous event, but especially for spearheading the historic request for an advisory opinion before the ICJ. Their unwavering dedication to combating climate change and their relentless pursuit of climate justice serve as a beacon of hope and inspiration for us all. As a senior fellow in global climate change litigation at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law, my expertise has been honed through the years of dedicated study and meticulous tracking of the evolving climate litigation movement. I have had the privilege of collaborating with esteemed colleagues who have laid the foundation for my work over the past decade. And in this extraordinary juncture of history, we find ourselves at the cusp of an unprecedented moment, particularly within the climate justice movement. While we have witnessed significant milestones through landmark cases and groundbreaking decisions already, it is with great conviction that I assert the potential of this advisory opinion, coupled with those from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and International Tribunal for the Law of the Seas, to effect truly transformative global responses to the pressing climate crisis we face. The convergence of these powerful legal instruments holds the promise of reshaping our collective trajectory towards a more sustainable and just future. I am deeply humbled and grateful for the invitation to address this gathering and to offer my insights on what a favorable ICJ advisory opinion would encompass. Together, let us embark on this crucial discussion and explore the transformative potential of international law in the face of the climate emergency. And as I reflected upon the question at hand regarding the characteristics of a favorable ICJ advisory opinion and its implications for the progressive development of international law and climate action, I'm compelled to consider my own qualifications to address this matter. It's undeniable that I'm fortunate to occupy a privileged position residing in New York and working within an institution that affords me a platform for advocacy. However, my perspective is not solely shaped by these external factors, and it is enriched by my unique identity as a woman, as a mother, and as a representative of the global South. And I always like to say that I'm from Brazil, which is where I'm at the moment, and that really shapes where I come from when I'm responding to this question. So my roots and upbringing really play an integral role in shaping my worldview, reminding me of the diverse perspectives that must be considered in addressing complex issues such as climate change. And while I'm no longer part of the youth movement, my role as a mother really imbues me with this sense of concern for intergenerational justice, recognizing the urgent need to safeguard a sustainable and habitable planet for future generations. So my response to this inquiry encompasses this multifaceted approach. Firstly, it draws upon my scholarly experience, of course, which has been cultivated through extensive research and analysis, spending decades on the development of climate change law, and more specifically on climate change litigation. But it is not only confined to academic knowledge. It's also informed by these worldviews and concerns that I previously highlighted, the lens through which I view and what a favorable advisory opinion would entail. So I envision such an opinion not only as a progressive step in the evolution of climate change, but also as a response that resonates with our global community, encompassing inclusivity and addressing the needs and aspirations of all rather than a selective few. It's essential that the advisory opinion provides a comprehensive and equitable solution, serving as a catalyst for collective action and laying the groundwork for a sustainable future that benefits every individual and nation. So a favorable ICJ AO in the context of climate change law would encompass several key elements that would contribute to the progressive development of international law and climate action. These elements would address the scientific consensus in climate change, provide a rights-based perspective, embrace international environmental law principles, clarify specific obligations of states, and recognize and address vulnerabilities within the climate crisis. So firstly, the ICJAO would begin by unequivocally and acknowledging and actively engaging with the scientific consensus on climate change and the urgent need for decisive action. This recognition would entail acknowledging the overwhelming evidence and consensus among scientists regarding the reality of climate change, its underlying causes, and the severe consequences it imposes on human societies and the environment. By emphasizing the scientific foundation of climate change, the AO would serve to fortify the critical importance of grounding legal responses in sound scientific knowledge. Moreover, it would play a pivotal role in dispelling any lingering doubts surrounding the impacts of climate change on communities worldwide, and unequivocally addressing climate deniers and countering the spread of misinformation. As the world's preeminent judicial body, the ICJ has the power to establish a definitive stance on climate change and debunk any unfounded claims, reinforcing the credibility and authority of the court's pronouncements. Secondly, the AO would embrace a rights-based perspective on climate change, seamlessly integrating human rights responses into its overarching framework. The ICJ is not a human rights court. However, this inclusive approach is consistent with international law and would entail a recognition that climate change has direct and indirect consequences that impact the enjoyment of fundamental human rights, including but not limited to the right to life, health, food, water, and healthy environment. By firmly establishing the integration of human rights within the framework, the AO would bring to the forefront the moral and legal obligations of states to safeguard and fulfill these rights in the context of climate change. Notably, the AO would align with the landmark adoption of the right to a healthy environment by the UN General Assembly in 2021, signifying a pivotal moment in the evolution of a rights-based approach to environmental protection and climate change. Moreover, the AO would build upon the foundation set by numerous rights-based climate litigation cases worldwide, leveraging the jurisprudence that has already recognized the pervasive impacts of climate change on human rights. By anchoring its approach in the protection of human rights, the AO would contribute to the consolidation of a robust and just legal framework that addresses the intersecting challenges of climate change and human well-being. Thirdly, the AO would wholeheartedly embrace the fundamental principles of international environmental law, several of which it has already recognized, that the ICJ has already recognized, serving as a guiding compass for its comprehensive approach. These principles include, but are not limited to, the precautionary principle, the principle of prevention, the principle of avoiding transboundary harm, the principle of solidarity, the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, equity under international law, the obligation to provide remedies for human rights violations arising from climate change, the principles of good faith and public participation. And all of these principles are highlighted in the status report that we worked to write alongside the other reports that were previously mentioned. Of particular significance would be the AO's emphasis on the principle of international cooperation. It would expound upon the obligations of states to collaborate and cooperate in addressing climate change, highlighting the imperative of providing financial commitments to support the endeavors of least developed countries and small island nations that bear a disproportionate burden of the climate crisis. This principled stance would underscore the collective responsibility of all states in combating climate change, while simultaneously ensuring fairness in the distribution of both burdens and benefits. By centering on these principles, the AO would fortify the foundation of international environmental law and reinforce the indispensable role of cooperation and equity in shaping effective climate action at a global scale. Fourthly, and perhaps most importantly, the AO would clarify specific obligations of states in relation to mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, adapting to climate change, and providing for loss and damage funds. The AO would comprehensively outline the responsibilities of states in reducing their greenhouse gas emissions in accordance with the objectives outlined in the Paris Agreement and other pertinent international accords. It would decisively assert that there exists a collective obligation for all nations to curtail greenhouse gas emissions, ensuring alignment with the critical target of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This clarity would underscore the notion that every country must commit to its fair share of emissions reductions, recognizing that true progress necessitates a shared burden borne by all. Moreover, the AO would emphasize the duty of states not only to develop and implement effective adaptation measures to address the impacts of climate change within their own jurisdictions, but also to foster cooperation and solidarity in assisting other countries, particularly those disproportionately affected, in their adaptation efforts. The obligation to adapt extends beyond national boundaries, requiring concerted efforts to support and uplift vulnerable nations facing the most severe consequences of the climate crisis. By emphasizing this cooperative approach, the AO would underscore the importance of international collaboration in tackling the multifaceted challenges posed by climate change. In addition, the AO would recognize the imperative of establishing robust financial mechanisms to provide assistance to developing countries grappling with the loss and damage caused by climate change. This acknowledgement highlights the need for equitable support systems that aid nations in coping with the far-reaching impacts and challenges arising from climate-related disruptions. By recognizing the necessity of financial resources and mechanisms to address loss and damage, the AO would reinforce the principle of justice and ensure that those countries bearing the brunt of climate change receive the necessary assistance to navigate the aftermath. Although the request for an advisory opinion does not address loss and damage specifically, this would still be consistent within international law and the international climate regime specifically. By addressing these critical aspects, the AO would play a transformative role in shaping international law and advancing climate action, providing clear guidance on emissions reductions, adaptation efforts, and mechanisms for addressing loss and damage. Its impact would extend far beyond legal discourse, serving as a catalyst for equitable and sustainable global responses to the pressing challenges posed by the climate crisis. Lastly, the AO would address vulnerabilities within the climate crisis and acknowledge acknowledge that the impacts of climate change are not distributed evenly among populations. It would highlight the disproportionate burden borne by certain groups, particularly those who are already vulnerable and marginalized. This includes recognizing and engage with the North-South disparities of the climate crisis and specific vulnerable groups within both the global North and the global South. The AO would address the particular vulnerabilities faced by indigenous communities, low-income communities, coastal communities, small-scale farmers, women and girls, Black and colored communities, and people with disabilities. By understanding and addressing these disparities, the AO would emphasize the importance of equitable and inclusive climate action. Overall, a favorable ICJ AO in line with the aforementioned elements would contribute to the progressive development of international law and climate action by providing clarity on the obligations of states, integrating scientific knowledge and human rights principles, promoting international cooperation, and addressing vulnerabilities within the climate crisis. It would serve as a guiding document for legal practitioner, policymakers, advocates, helping to shape effective and just climate change policies and legal frameworks at the international level and spur further litigation further on. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Maria Antonia. It was great that you brought on synergies from the Inter-American Code AO and the ITLOS AO, and huge gratitude from WYCJ and PIFCC for the contribution on the status report to the SEBEN Center. Moving on to the next and the final speaker of the day, I would like to invite Katrina and ask her or request her to talk about how CSOs and grassroots movements can utilize the Youth Climate Justice Handbook to move climate action forward.
Thank you, Aditi. For those I haven't met, I'm Katrina Bullock, and I'm the General Counsel at Greenpeace Australia Pacific. I'm also incredibly fortunate to be part of a global network of Greenpeace organizations around the world with over 25 offices in over 55 countries. I have had the absolute pleasure of supporting Vishal and the students and the broader alliance on this campaign over the last few years. And I am here today because I live in Sydney, and 3 years ago, I sat choking on thick black smog that filled my lungs and blanketed my city. It was the Black Summer bushfires. Pregnant women were forced indoors for fear of what that smoke inhalation would do to their unborn children. 3 billion animals perished that summer. 34 people died and thousands were left homeless. Yet I was one of the lucky ones. And then 2 years ago, I found myself diving on a reef near where I live in Australia. And I found myself mourning because this beautiful underwater world full of life and vibrancy that I had grown up with and absolutely fallen in love with as a child just did not exist anymore. And as I looked around, like, there was no life. It was the exact same place. And yet it was coral as far as the eye could see, bleached white, the color of bone. And that reef had been subject to what would be one of many very destructive, severe mass bleaching events across our country and across our oceans. Mass bleaching events that wiped out entire ecosystems and affected the food source of local communities. And again, I was one of the lucky ones. And then a year ago, I found myself rushing my mother to the emergency room at a broken hospital in Lismore. The windows were boarded up. There were entire wings of that hospital that were completely in disrepair and dilapidated. This was right after the Lismore floods. And these were floods in which many members of my family and my friends were left on rooftops stranded. Some of them trapped inside their roof cavities, unable to get out while the floodwaters rose. These were floods that would in a week, completely destroy the heritage and the culture and the future of an entire town. Yet, I was one of the lucky ones. And then earlier this year, I find myself feeling very helpless in Australia while I was communicating with one of my dear colleagues and friends who is here today. He was ankle deep in water with his shoulder up against a door in pitch blackness for many, many hours throughout the night to try and keep that door from blowing off because of the torrential downpour and the severe rain that had already caused other doors and roofs in the community to blow off. He had an elderly woman behind him in the dwelling seeking shelter. This was the Vanuatu twin cyclones earlier this year. Twin cyclones that wiped out approximately 40% of Vanuatu's GDP in a week. Cyclones that meant that thousands of people were left without access to clean drinking water, without shelter. Cyclones that destroyed medical centres and homes. And yet again, I was one of the lucky ones. I'm not sharing these climate change related stories with you to elicit sympathy, because I know that in every single one of these situations, I was afforded a great deal of privilege and safety and luck that frankly, a lot of people aren't. So I do not share these stories with you to elicit sympathy. I share them with you because if you are in this room today, or if you are joining us virtually online, then you are also one of the lucky ones. You are here. You have a once in a lifetime opportunity to be part of a campaign that can help shape international law to protect the human rights of people in these situations. Protect the right to life, to health, to food, to safe, clean drinking water, to an adequate standard of living for communities around the world. This opportunity is invaluable. It will not come again in your lifetime. To the diplomats and the members of country missions that have joined us here today, whether you realize it yet or not, this will be a defining moment in your career. One day when you are old and grey, lying on your deathbed, hopefully after a very long and happy and healthy life, and hopefully surrounded by your family and friends, I can guarantee you, you are going to want to look into the eyes of your children and your children's children and know that you did everything in your power to create a safe and healthy world for them. And that starts here. Because while you and I may be the lucky ones, they won't be. And it will not matter where they live. Because we all know the science. We know that even if we achieve the current nationally determined contributions within the time frame and the government commitments for emission reductions, we will still see a world of warming of around 2.6 degrees within this century. The climate crisis is a human rights crisis. Every part of a degree of global warming denies the human rights of millions of people around the world. We are all in this together. No one country can solve the problem of the climate crisis. So we have to work with every nation around the world to bring them on board. And that is what the ICJ Advisory Opinion does. It can create a baseline for the minimum obligations every government owes to protect current and future generations in the face of the climate crisis. So country delegates, you have the youth of the world begging you to make bold, ambitious submissions that advance the law and set a strong baseline. You have over 1,500 civil society and grassroots organizations like Greenpeace standing ready and willing to back you in if you take an ambitious stance. And you also have incredibly helpful materials to assist you in making your submissions to the court. Thank you to Eduardo and Dr. Maria and the team. This campaign may have been born in a small classroom in the Pacific by those that were affected first and worst by the climate crisis, but it has grown to a global movement for a reason. We heard from Dr. Chris Bartlett about his experience in Bonn. about there still being so many people in international negotiations and governments that do not accept the best available science on climate change. An opinion from the world's highest court has the potential to cement the consensus on climate science in a way that we have never seen before. It has the power to increase ambitions under international instruments like the Paris Agreement, and to breathe new life into multinational negotiations and international cooperation. As Eduardo mentioned, advisory opinions in and of themselves are not legally binding, but the law they are interpreting often is. The clarification that the court can provide about how the law should be interpreted will be cited as persuasive precedent in climate cases around the world. It will guide local, national, and international adjudications, and it will be picked up by lawmaking bodies. So, with all of this in mind, Aditi has asked, what is the role of civil society organizations as we enter this next phase of the campaign? Well, over the next few months, you will see grassroots and civil society organizations working hard to get this handbook in the hands of every leader around the world. You will see civil society organizations apply for leave from the court to make submissions, or teaming up with international organizations and nations who are making submissions to assist them in that endeavor. You will see us mobilizing your constituents and applying pressure. You will see us center the voices of Pacifica, of youth, of those who are most impacted by the climate crisis, to remind you what we are fighting for and what is coming. We will be watching. We will be bringing together and holding space for legal academics, for experts who can author pieces that will assist the court in its deliberations. During the submission process, we will be celebrating countries who make bold submissions and calling out those who do not. We will be at the court hearings. We will be in The Hague. We will be amplifying the work you do and the pivotal decisions you make, because human rights should never be a matter of luck.
Thank you, Katrina, for such a heartfelt story that you shared, and also the importance of it, also humanizing this whole legal process that's to come. I think that's what is important. That's the kind of bridge that civil society has been able to gap. Since we are short of time, I am going to say that we will have time for questions. I'm opening the floor now, but unfortunately, it will be less than 20 minutes. So if anyone has questions, kindly raise your hand, and one of us will come to you with the mic. And I kindly request you to just introduce yourself very briefly in like a sentence before you ask the question.
We're talking about emissions by NGOs, for example, or other parties. How would that work? And my understanding is that these are treated in a different way than emissions by states, of course. But what are the possibilities, and how can we work on that? And as like sub question to that is it true that states can add those emissions in their admission, if that makes sense? So if they can quote the views of NGOs in that country. Thank you.
Hello. I think that I'm going to take that question. Well, in principle, as I mentioned, only intergovernmental organizations and states are allowed to participate in advisory proceedings. That doesn't mean that there are not other venues that can be explored. So one venue is, of course, to approach, depending on the information you have, depending on the type of document you have, you could approach one specific state or group of states that might be interested in the information you have, so they can use it in order to support their statements. So they can put it as an annex your document, and in that way, your document will be part of the case, and can be referred by the states during the oral hearings and by other states if they want to. That's one option. Another option is for you to, under Practice Direction 12, you send the documents to the court, and the court will allocate that document in the Peace Palace, and will inform the parties that there is a section in the Peace Palace where they can go and check the documents that are at their disposal that come from different NGOs. Now, here, there is something that needs to be clarified. Before 1994, the court used to publish the communications of the registry. So you could see what NGOs or which entities send communications to the court. That practice no longer exists. So unfortunately, the informations that will be sent by NGOs or entities is not going to be reflected in the records of the court. So that means that you, as an international organization, as an NGO, will have to, by yourself, go outside and try to reach as many states as possible through social or civil society in general, in order to make them aware of the existence of the documents that you're providing. So I think that those are the most clear path that you have.
Thank you, Edgardo. Just the one over here.
Hi, my name is Lester. I'm from Guatemala, Embassy of Guatemala here in the Netherlands. And I would like to ask a question. Maybe you can elaborate in terms of the litigation strategy, in terms of how do you foresee the interplay of the different advisory opinions requests in different fora, and how these complement, probably it would be the word, each other, especially when you see the repetition of certain actors. And I asked this question because I just got the notification from ICJ that the Commission on Small Island States has been admitted to participate in this advisory opinion request. So evidently the strategy is taking place. So I would like to hear from you how you see that strategy playing out for the benefit of the different requests out there. Thank you.
Just to, before Edgardo, if you want to this question to Maria Antonia, if she's still online.
Yes, I am. Yeah, that's it. Do you want me to start or do you? Okay, because I'm hearing an echo, so I'm not sure, but I'm just going to answer it. There is definitely a strategy going on behind the scenes to see how these different advisory opinion requests are relate to one another. Although I would say that there are so many people working in that space that it's probably more an ad hoc strategy happening. There are several countries in NGOs and other types of partners who are seeing the process within the Inter-American Court as a process that could be leveraged towards the other initiatives, mostly because the rules for presenting amicus briefs it's a lot broader than on the other two processes. And the court, the Inter-American Court in and of itself is a more progressive court. So, you know, the deadline for submitting amicus briefs to the Inter-American Court is on August 18th, and it is expected, you know, the previous advisory opinion, which related to human rights and the environment, received over 50 submissions. It's expected that this one will receive even more. And, you know, we know also from, you know, talking to different stakeholders that the courts in and of itself are looking at what the others are doing. And the timeline expected is that ITLOS will probably be coming with its advisory opinion first, because the process is moving a little faster. Then it will be the Inter-American Court and then the ICJ. So there will be obviously a benefit of being the third court addressing some of these similar issues, mostly because the ICJ is a more traditional court, and the question for ICLOS is more, it's more specific, obviously, to that specific regime, but the Inter-American Court one and the ICJ are more related. There are several questions that are similar. So there is definitely an interaction there, an opportunity to engage in those different processes to try to advance the sort of that progressive development of international climate change law. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Maria Antonia. And just coming back to you before that, I think it would be also interesting to have Chris's perspective on this from a government perspective. Chris, are you still there?
Yes, I am. And in fact, I think the strategy is very much alive and underway. So of course, Vanuatu is a part of the COSIS, the Coalition of Small Island States on International Law. And we've recently made our submission to the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, very much in line with the positions of those countries in regard to the question to the ICJ. So obviously, we want consistency in international law. It would be of no one's benefit if each one of these tribunals and courts gave a different interpretation. So we're absolutely working as hard as we can to ensure that we're providing our perspectives in a consistent and similar way. And as was mentioned, I think the ICJ would probably be the final court to provide its advisory opinion. So to really take on board what these other courts have done in a comprehensive and holistic way.
Thank you so much, Chris. I hope that answers your questions, or we have experts to clarify it further. Okay, if that's aren't any more questions from the floor? Okay, okay, go ahead, Edgardo.
Yes, not an expert on mics, definitely. Just one thing, I think that it is important to highlight that the communication and the collaboration should go beyond regions right now. If we take into account that the proceedings before ICLOS and ICJ are confidential in nature, as I mentioned during my intervention, that means that the conversation cannot be limited to regions. So it has to go beyond regions, in the sense that some states that are not participating in ICLOS and are not getting copies of the statement that are being filed in ICLOS are not going to be aware what the position is, and then they will be filing documents in October to the court. So I think that the conversation has to be broad, and it has to be inclusive with many regions and states that are willing to participate in any of these proceedings. And also, I would like to mention something about something that is told a lot, and is about how progressive the Inter-American Court of Human Rights is and how traditional or conservative the ICJ is. I don't think that we should state in that type of mentality. The ICJ has developed environmental international law during the last 30 years. Arbitrary tribunals have developed environmental international law. The ICJ has the jurisdiction over any type of dispute that states decide to bring before it. So thinking that the court will stay in a conservative space when answering the question that has been asked by the General Assembly, I think that is a mistake. I think that we should trust in the court, and that we should enter this proceeding by thinking that they are going to stay within a comfort zone when answering this question. So I think that shouldn't be an issue anymore. That's the only 2 points that I wanted to ask.
Thank you so much, Edgardo. Are there any more questions on the floor, from the floor? If none, I actually have a question for Chris, and I think I'm safe to say over here that it's a question not just us as youth, but I think as civil society gets, and from a civil society perspective, Chris, I think we would like to know that how the AO would complement the UNFCCC negotiations.
Well, thank you very much. I highlighted in the slide the preamble of the Paris Agreement, which specifically mentions the obligations of states on human rights and intergenerational equity. Yet we come to the negotiations without clarity on what exactly those obligations are. And in the rooms over the last 2 weeks in Germany, we came again and again against a brick wall of one party not understanding fully, or with a completely different understanding of the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC as another party. And so really, this process has an incredible opportunity to bring us all to a base understanding of the interpretation of obligations. And if we had that base understanding, it would be so much easier to progress the issues that have been stuck for years and years, the issues around finance. If we were to answer that second question about the consequences of harm, that could very easily unlock some of the finance discussions. When it comes to obligations to protect the climate system, that could unlock the negotiations around mitigation and ambition. And of course, now we're in the discussions on loss and damage, which could benefit greatly by this comprehensive clarification of international law. So really, this is an opportunity to fast track the implementation of the Paris Agreement. States themselves, even without engaging in the negotiations, states themselves can take this clarity and ratchet up their NDCs, which is what Vanuatu, we did when we looked at our international obligations under the range of treaties and instruments. So really, this is an interlinked process. It affects the SDGs, it affects the interpretation of different legal instruments, and it hopefully is going to bring us much closer to this goal of preventing runaway dangerous climate change past 1.5 degrees.
Thank you so much, Chris. I think that clarifies a lot of it. If there are no more questions, I would like to give the floor for final remarks from Vishal and Katrina, if any.
If I can just have I was just going to say one final comment with respect to some of the remarks here that some of these documents will not be available within the court documents, some of these submissions. I'd just like to say that obviously the Sabin Center has a huge database of climate change litigation cases, and then we're more than happy to include all of these submissions within the documents that are available for each case. So if NGOs want to share that with us, we're happy to include that as well, and then all of the submissions should be made available there too.
Just thank you all for sharing the space today and for your time and being part of a movement that can do some really big things. So if you are an ambassador, please do go away, put together persuasive, bold, ambitious submissions. And if you need any assistance, reach out. The Vanuatu government had an email address on screen where you can get pro bono legal support. And there's many grassroots organizations and NGOs like Greenpeace that stand ready, willing, and able to assist as well. So please, please do reach out.
Thank you so much, Katrina. And just before I conclude, I would really immensely show gratitude and like to thank all the panelists for such an engaging and enriching discussion, and also answering so many interesting questions. I also express my immense gratitude to the director of ILO in The Hague for hosting us, and of course, everyone in the audience that took part today on their Tuesday afternoon to be here. I think it is safe to say that from today's discussion that such an AO needs to be progressive, given the current situation all over the world, and however politicized this issue is at climate change as an issue is at the moment. It doesn't change the fact that every day a fisherman on every coast in any country in the world, farmers in any country in the world are losing their land, they're losing their livelihoods, they're losing their homes, they're losing their identity and their culture. We owe them this, and we owe it to their children and our children. And that's all from me. I have been told to speak on the mic again, so everyone who's here, there's a reception organized just at the back. There'll be refreshments available, and please help yourself to it. And thank you so much, and thank you everyone who joined us online as well.